The girl's voice was so soft it almost vanished in the wind. "Please? Can we eat now?" Her hands were clasped tight around her little brother's, both of them standing barefoot on the porch of a stranger's house. Their clothes hung loose, torn and dust-stained, like they'd been walking for days. Clara Holt froze in the doorway, one hand clutching the frame to steady herself. The words cut through her like a blade. She hadn't heard anyone say please in months. Not since her husband's funeral. Not since the war that had taken him. The boy beside the girl didn't speak, just stared at the floorboards. His lips cracked, his cheeks hollow. Clara's throat tightened. The only sound was the dry creak of the porch and the faint rattle of wind through brittle grass. She wanted to answer them, but her voice wouldn't come. Instead, she stepped back and slammed the door. 3 days earlier, the prairie was quiet, eerily quiet. The sky stretched wide and pale, the sun harsh enough to bleach the earth of its color. Clara had been out near the barn, stacking what little firewood she had left. Her fingers numb despite the heat. Her husband Samuel had built this ranch from nothing. He'd chosen the spot for its view of the far hills, where the cottonwoods cut through the valley like a green ribbon. But now the hills felt too far, too empty. The war had taken more than Samuel. It had left the land hollow. Most of the men who returned from fighting didn't look the same, if they returned at all. The town was a shell of what it used to be. Clara lived alone now, except for the memories that clung to the walls. His coat still hung by the door. His boots sat under the bed. She hadn't touched them. That evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, Clara saw movement in the distance. 2 figures, small, frail, walking the dusty trail that cut through the plain. At first, she thought they were travelers heading for town. But as they drew closer, her chest sank. Children. The girl couldn't have been more than 12. The boy looked half her age. Both walked like every step hurt. Clara stayed on the porch, rifle leaning against the wall beside her. She told herself they'd pass by. They had to. Strangers didn't come here without reason. But they didn't pass by. The girl lifted her head, met Clara's eyes, and stopped at the foot of the steps. No one spoke. The wind carried the faint rattle of dry weeds against the fence. Clara's pulse kicked hard in her ears. She gripped the edge of the porch rail. The girl swallowed, her lips pale. Then she whispered it. "Please? Can we eat now?" Clara slammed the door because it was easier than answering. She pressed her back against it, breath shallow. Her hands shook. She hated herself for it, but she didn't know what else to do. Food was scarce. The last of the flour sat in a tin near the stove. Winter had been cruel, and the summer crops hadn't taken root like they used to. Every choice felt like gambling with survival. Through the door, she heard the faint shuffle of footsteps. The boy coughed, then silence. Clara shut her eyes. That night, she couldn't sleep. She lay in the bed she'd shared with Samuel, staring at the ceiling as moonlight spilled across the floor. She thought of their faces. She thought of Samuel's last words before he rode off to war, words that haunted her still. "Don't let this land make you hard, Clara. It's all too easy." When morning came, she walked to the door. The porch was empty, but out in the yard, near the fence line, she saw 2 small shapes curled together in the dust. The boy's head rested against his sister's shoulder. His eyes were closed. They hadn't gone anywhere. Clara stood frozen in the doorway, the air heavy around her. The rifle still leaned against the wall. Her gaze drifted from it to the children, back and forth, as if she needed to choose between 2 versions of herself. In town, people had grown suspicious, even cruel. Strangers weren't welcome. Not in these parts, not anymore. Everyone knew the stories. Orphans stealing from barns, drifters killing for food. Kindness had become a luxury most couldn't afford. Clara knew exactly what the neighbors would say if she took the children in. She also knew what Samuel would have said. The wind picked up, tugging at her dress. The girl stirred, her eyes fluttering open. For a moment, they just stared at each other. Clara's chest ached as if something deep inside was breaking loose after too long buried. She stepped down from the porch. 1 step, then another. The girl didn't move, just held her brother closer. Clara crouched in front of them, voice low. "You hungry?" The girl nodded so faint Clara almost missed it. Clara reached for the boy. His skin was hot, feverish. She looked back toward the house, then toward the far hills where no one could see what choice she was about to make. The door stood open behind her now, just like Samuel used to leave it when neighbors came calling. For the first time in months, Clara Holt stepped aside. "Come on," she whispered. "Let's get you warm." Clara set a pot of water on the stove, her hands trembling as she worked. The fire snapped to life with dry pops of mesquite wood, and soon the small kitchen was filled with a faint warmth it hadn't felt in weeks. The children sat at the table, too exhausted to speak. The girl's hands rested protectively over her brother's, her fingers raw and blistered. The boy's head lolled against the tabletop, his breathing shallow. Clara measured out the last of her flour and cornmeal, her throat tight as she poured it into a bowl. The motions felt mechanical, like her body was moving on its own while her mind screamed at her to stop. If she fed them, she'd have nothing left for herself. She glanced at the cupboard, empty but for a jar of dried beans and a single strip of salted pork. Samuel's hunting rifle stood propped against the wall, silent witness to her choice. The girl's voice broke the quiet. "Ma'am." Clara turned. The girl looked down at her lap. "We can work. We're not beggars." Clara swallowed hard. She hadn't been called ma'am in years, not since Samuel died. "You don't owe me work," Clara said softly, though her voice felt foreign in her own ears. The girl's eyes shimmered, but she didn't answer. By the time the sun rose higher, the house smelled faintly of cornbread. The boy stirred awake as Clara set a plate in front of him. His small hands trembled as he tore a piece of bread, stuffing it into his mouth like he feared it might be taken away. Clara sat across from them, her own plate untouched. "You got a name?" she asked quietly. The girl looked up, hesitant. "Mary. And him. James," she said. Her hand rested gently on the boy's hair. "He's 6. Clara studied their faces, the same hollow look she'd seen in too many widows and too many children left behind by war. "Where are your folks?" Mary's lips pressed tight. She looked toward the window, her shoulders curling in as if bracing for a blow. Clara didn't ask again. By afternoon, Clara was in town for the first time in weeks. The general store's bell jingled as she stepped inside. Heads turned immediately. "Clara Holt," one of the women said, adjusting her shawl. "Ain't seen you in near a month." Clara nodded stiffly, grabbing a small sack of flour and a bit of dried coffee. Her fingers hovered over the sugar tin, then pulled back. She didn't have the money for luxuries anymore. "You hear about them drifters?" A man's voice came from behind the counter. "2 kids been seen wandering up by the old Carson place. Some say they've been stealing chickens out by the ridge." Clara's hand froze on the counter. "Should run 'em off before trouble finds us," another man muttered near the stove. "War's barely ended, and now we're letting strays eat what little we got left." The words stung sharper than she expected. Clara placed her coins on the counter, her movements deliberate. On her way out, Mrs. Lively, the preacher's wife, caught her sleeve. "Clara," she said, voice low, "you've been alone too long. It's dangerous living out there by yourself. Don't you go letting trouble inside your home." Clara met her eyes but didn't answer. She left the store in silence, the sack of flour heavy in her hands. That evening, Mary stood barefoot near the barn, sleeves rolled up as she tried to haul water from the well. Clara watched from the porch, arms folded. "You don't have to," Clara said. Mary didn't stop. "We can work. I told you." Clara descended the steps slowly, taking the rope from Mary's hands. Together, they pulled the bucket up, muscles straining with the effort. James sat on the porch steps, cradling a thin black cat that had wandered from the barn. The boy's smile, small, fleeting, hit Clara harder than she'd expected. The next day, word had spread. Clara was loading the stove when the sound of hoofbeats drew her to the window. 2 men on horseback rode up slow, hats low, rifles slung across their saddles. It was John McCreary and Thomas Webb, neighbors from 2 miles east. Clara stepped onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. "Morning," she said carefully. McCreary spat into the dirt. "Heard you got yourself company." Clara said nothing. Webb leaned forward in his saddle. "Couple of strays. Town says they've been seen before. Stealing." "They're children," Clara said evenly. "Children or not," McCreary replied. "You let 'em stay, they'll bring trouble. Indians, drifters, whoever they belong to. You got no man to guard this place. You think they just wandered out here by chance?" Clara's grip tightened on the porch rail. Webb shifted in his saddle, eyes narrowing. "Send 'em off, Clara. It's the smart thing." Clara didn't answer. The men stared at her a long moment, then turned their horses. As they rode off, Clara's chest felt hollow. She looked back through the doorway. Mary stood just inside, James clutching her hand, his eyes wide. That night, Clara sat at the table long after the children were asleep. Samuel's rifle lay across her lap. She could hear the wind outside, the distant howl of coyotes. Every instinct screamed that she was making a mistake. But when she thought of Mary's thin voice, "Please, can we eat now?" Clara knew she couldn't send them away. She also knew what would come next. The next morning, the first sign appeared. A single rider, far out near the ridge, watching her house from the hills. And then another. The rider on the ridge didn't move. Clara watched from the window, heart hammering. The figure sat tall in the saddle, rifle across their lap, the horse shifting restlessly beneath them. Mary stood beside her, clutching James close. "Do you know them?" Clara asked quietly. Mary's lips pressed tight. She shook her head. The rider stayed until the sun dipped low, then turned and disappeared beyond the ridge. By nightfall, Clara had barred the doors. The rifle leaned within reach, Samuel's old revolver on the table. Mary and James slept curled together on a blanket near the hearth. Clara sat in the rocker, her fingers tight around the rifle's stock. The prairie was too quiet, and then came the sound. The faint rhythm, far away hoofbeats. The first light, Clara stepped outside. The sky was heavy with clouds, the air sharp with the smell of rain. Out near the far hills, 3 riders now watched from a distance. By noon, there were 5. That afternoon, McCreary arrived again, Webb at his side. "We warned you," McCreary said, voice low. "Word is, them kids belong to that wagon train that got raided by Kiowa. Maybe they got kin comin' to finish what they started." "They're just children," Clara said. "You don't know that," Webb shot back. "They're not yours to keep," McCreary added. "Send 'em off now, before this turns bad for all of us." Clara's hands curled at her sides. "They'll die if I send them away." McCreary's jaw tightened. "Better them than you." The men rode off without another word, but Clara knew it wouldn't be the last time they came. That night, the hoofbeats returned, closer this time. Mary woke, eyes wide with fear. "They're watching," she whispered. Clara stoked the fire higher. "Go back to sleep." But neither of them slept. By morning, a thin column of smoke curled into the sky beyond the hills. Clara stepped out onto the porch, her breath catching. She knew what that meant. Warriors were nearby. Mary stood behind her, trembling. "Mary," Clara said softly, "who's out there?" Mary shook her head, eyes glistening. "I don't know. I don't know." But Clara saw the way she avoided her gaze, the way her arms tightened protectively around James. Late that afternoon, riders appeared, 7 of them this time, cresting the ridge like ghosts against the gray sky. They didn't approach, only watched. The lead rider lifted an arm, pointing toward the ranch. Clara's chest tightened. She stepped back inside, bolting the door. Night fell heavy. The wind carried distant drums now, slow, deliberate. Mary sat by the fire, James curled against her side. Clara knelt beside the rifle, checking the chamber. She'd never fired it at a man before. The first shot rang out just before dawn. Not close, just a warning, echoing through the hills. Clara jerked awake, the rifle in her hands before she realized she'd moved. Mary's face was pale in the firelight. "They're coming," she whispered. When the sun rose, Clara stepped outside, rifle cradled in her arms. Across the prairie, more riders appeared. 15 now, maybe more, scattered along the ridgeline like vultures waiting for something to die. Clara stood her ground on the porch, jaw tight. The wind whipped through the brittle grass, carrying the faint, steady beat of the war drums. She knew this wasn't random. Someone had come for the children. From behind her, Mary's voice broke. "They're here for us." The riders didn't charge. They stayed on the ridge, still as stones, the morning light glinting off rifles slung across their backs. Clara stood rooted to the porch, heart pounding. The rifle felt too heavy in her hands. Behind her, Mary stepped forward, trembling. "Please," the girl whispered, her voice cracking. "Don't shoot. They won't hurt you, not if I go." Clara turned sharply. "What do you mean?" Mary's chin quivered. "They're Kiowa. My mother was one of them. Before she married my pa. They'll take us back." Clara's breath caught. "And if they don't?" Mary's gaze dropped to her brother. "Then they'll kill you trying." For a long moment, neither moved. The prairie wind roared around them. "Mary," Clara said quietly, "you don't have to." Mary stepped past her, out onto the porch. The riders shifted, their horses stamping nervously at the sight of her. Mary lifted her hands, palms open, calling something in a language Clara couldn't understand. The lead rider urged his horse a few steps forward. Clara's throat tightened. She saw now the truth Samuel had always known, how people here never tried to understand the lives they feared. Mary spoke softly, her words steady despite the tremble in her shoulders. "They don't want to hurt you," she said at last, turning back to Clara. "But if you try to keep us, they will." James clung to his sister's dress, silent tears streaking his cheeks. Clara lowered the rifle slowly. Her hands shook as she placed it down by her side. "Tell them," her voice caught. She forced herself to meet Mary's eyes. "Tell them I mean no harm. Tell them I just wanted you to live." Mary nodded, then turned back to the riders, speaking in that same quiet, flowing tongue. The lead rider dismounted. He approached slowly, hands empty, his dark eyes fixed on Clara. His face was weathered, lined with years of sun and grief. When he stopped a few paces away, he looked at Mary, then at Clara. Mary spoke to him in Kiowa. He listened, then glanced at Clara again. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then he placed a hand over his chest and bowed his head once. Mary knelt in the dirt, drawing James close, speaking to him in a voice only he could hear. Clara watched, throat tight. The boy clung to her desperately, shaking his head as if refusing to let go. Mary held him tighter, whispering, calming, until at last he loosened his grip. The riders wait.